Okay, so let's discuss this system. So, endocrine system. Regulation of bodily functions. Okay, regulation of bodily functions together with the nervous system. The feature of endocrine glands is that they secrete hormones, and hormones are secreted generally, we consider blood, but extracellular fluid also counts. Okay? All hormones have to interact with the receptors, and we're going to spend some time discussing how this works. So, endocrine system isn't a collection of organs that are connected to each other physically. They're connected to each other more chemically. Okay, some of them are not connected to each other at all. The primary organs, primary endocrine organs, are listed here. So these organs, their function is to produce hormones, and they pretty much have none. There is a bit of a contention whether a pancreas have to be considered primary or secondary endocrine organ, but since it secretes pancreatic juice and produces a shitload of hormones, we're going to put it in the list of primary. Okay? Now, endocrine and nervous system. They don't have, the only thing that they have in common, honestly, is that they regulate bodily functions. A lot of other stuff is different. So first of all, nervous system has voluntary and involuntary, somatic and autonomic branches. Most of them, of course, autonomic, but there's some fair amount of somatic controls of the skeletal muscles. Endocrine system is completely out of our conscious control. Signaling mechanisms are different. Endocrine signaling is entirely chemical, while nervous, obviously, it is chemical, electrical, chemical, electrical. Different signals, okay? Neurotransmitters act within the short range, remember? Synaptic cleft, and that's it. Hormones can act over long distances because they are released in blood. Response time, even for autonomic responses, is relatively fast. Hormonal responses, not necessarily. Can be fast, can be slow. Responses to certain hormones may take not even hours, but sometimes days. Okay. And nervous system, as you can imagine, can target both internal and external environments because of the voluntary, the somatic branch. Our skeletal muscles may alter the environment. Endocrine system is focused exclusively on the internal. Hormones are distinguished. One of the main features of all hormones is their ability to be dissolved in water. So we have water-soluble or hydrophilic hormones and lipid-soluble or hydrophobic hormones. So you need to know which hormones are hydrophilic, which hormones are hydrophobic. I will explain, it's very easy to memorize really. Categories wise, you have catechol amines, okay, such as norepinephrine, for example. Peptide hormones that consist of amino acids. and protein hormones that are obviously proteins. All of these guys are water soluble. Now, lipid soluble hormones include thyroid, T3 and T4, and steroid hormones, which are cholesterol derived. So, thyroid and steroid. There is logic in this classification because you may remember that your cell membrane can be represented this way. You have thinner. So you have this. That's a poor choice of colors. Give me 1 second. So blue are water soluble, right? And your cell membrane is organized in a way that hydrophilic heads of phospholipids are sticking out, while hydrophobic tails of fatty acids are facing in. And the inner part of the membrane, most of it, is hydrophobic. So what does that mean? It means that hydrophobic hormones can cross the membrane. And therefore, their receptors are located inside the cell. It can be either in the cytoplasm or nucleus. I will never ask you, like cytoplasm or nucleus, for any lipid soluble hormone. I can't ask you, aldosterone. Where would be receptor located? Inside the cell or on the surface? Now, why water-soluble hormones have their receptors located on the surface? Because they cannot cross the membrane, and therefore their receptors are on the surface of the cell. Okay? So when we're going to discuss the actions of different hormones, we are going to focus on the receptor location as well. Okay. Yeah, I think I can live with that. So first let's figure out what happens when a lipid-soluble hormone enters the cell. So you see it all starts, I'm going to try to number those steps. I'm trying to see which color. Okay. So first order of business here. When lipid-soluble hormone reaches the target cell, it's going to cross the membrane and enter into cytoplasm. So in this particular example, the receptor is in the cytoplasm. It doesn't have to be, it can be in the nucleus. It's absolutely totally fine. So hormone binds to its receptor, okay, producing receptor hormone complex, and this complex then enters the nucleus where DNA is. This complex binds right here to the DNA and initiates the process of transcription, which results in the production of messenger or mRNA. This mRNA is exported from nucleus into the cytoplasm, where it is translated into a protein. Now, you may remember from other biology classes that you took before that protein does almost all things in the cell. This protein can be some kind of a channel, it can be a signaling protein, it can be some enzyme, whatever. Point is, you get to the protein activation. Now, hear me out on this. Think about the process from the temporal standpoint. So entrance, it's fast. Binding to the receptor, also fast. Entering nucleus, okay, binding to DNA, it's fine. But then you have to spend a fair amount of time synthesizing RNA, right? Then you have to spend a fair amount of time processing it and exporting it out of the nucleus in the cytoplasm. And then you have to translate it. Does that make sense to you? So it takes a while. Okay? Now let's take a look at the signaling for the water-soluble hormones. There are two mechanisms precisely that I want, three mechanisms, I'm sorry, that I want you to know conceptually. And I will show you where, at which point, you should stop. Like, you don't need to know what happens afterwards. Okay? So, remember, the receptor is on the surface, and the hormone binds to it. This binding activates a protein called G protein. We considered G protein when we discussed the taste signaling and the smell signaling. The G protein binds to an enzyme called adenylyl or adenylate cyclase. Those are synonyms. And adenylate cyclase produces a signaling molecule called cyclic AMP. Now, the cyclic AMP is a very important intracellular messenger. It can activate a variety of enzymes, and this is exactly where we should stop, because in every case it will activate a certain set of enzymes. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Yeah? Okay. So, now think about, again, the timing of this. One hormone activates one G protein, which activates single adenylyl cyclase. And then this adenylyl cyclase starts producing an enormous number of those ATP, cyclic AMP molecules, I'm sorry, that can activate an enormous number of enzymes. So this step right here makes the signaling mediated by water-soluble hormones in general faster. Okay? As you will see, it is true for all three mechanisms. Now this is the signaling through phospholipase C. You also learned about it when we were talking about the gustatory system. So again, this is your hormone, the signaling molecule. And the little blue whatever is a receptor. GPCR means G protein coupled. Okay? So when hormone binds to the receptor, G protein gets activated. And gets, well, it's not G protein, it's actually, I need to put the proper G protein. G protein gets activated. And activated G protein activates phospholipase C, the enzyme that generates the signaling molecule called IP3, okay, inositol triphosphate. IP3 serves as the ligand for ligand gated calcium channels on the endoplasmic reticulum. Okay. So when IP3 binds to this calcium channel, this channel opens and calcium ions diffuse out of the endoplasmic reticulum into the cytoplasm. And that's full stop. What happens afterwards shouldn't concern you. Calcium is also an important intracellular messenger that can activate a bunch of various proteins. Okay? And then we have so-called tyrosine kinase hormones. So here we are. This is the receptor. This is the hormone. Hormone binds to the receptor and activates an enzyme that is the part of the receptor called tyrosine kinase. You may remember, and I'm going to put it on as a side note, we talked about it last week, that kinase adds phosphate. So adding phosphate allows you to chemically modify proteins. You can see it right here. And since phosphate is a negatively charged structure, okay, it will change protein structure and protein function. As a result, activating or inactivating certain cellular proteins. Does that make sense to you? Okay. So one mechanism for lipid soluble, 3 mechanisms for water soluble. Now, the production of hormones can be regulated by 3 main routes. One of them is the stimulus that is coming from another hormone. Here. Basically, all hormones that are produced in the anterior pituitary gland are regulated by other hormones. Another way to consider this is neural stimulus. So, for example, when you are stressed, your perception of stress triggers a whole pathway of hormone production that at the end of it results in the production of cortisol. The first hormone in that entire chain, it's stimulated by stress response. And finally, humoral stimulus. So what does that mean? Humor in Greek means fluid. So humoral response is any change in your internal environment, in your extracellular fluid. Increased blood sugar, decreased blood sugar, increased osmolality of blood, decreased osmolality of blood, and so on and so forth. Okay? So we're going to consider those mechanisms as we talk about hormones. So, a few more things. First, the regulation hormonal responses in terms of distance. Hormones, quite rare, but can act on the cells that produce them. We call this autocrine signaling. They can act on the cells that are adjacent, not too far. So basically, you don't need the transport via blood. That's going to be paracrine signaling. And finally, when hormones enter the bloodstream and are delivered to all different parts of our body, we call it endocrine signaling. In this conversation, we're going to focus on, obviously, endocrine signaling rather than anything else. Another important thing about hormones is that, by and large, their production is regulated via negative feedback. So, imbalance in homeostasis, for example, elevated blood glucose, results in the release of hormone, in this case, insulin, which increases the transport of glucose from the blood into the tissues, reducing the blood glucose, and that is your negative feedback, which restores homeostasis. There are two hormones, well, one pair, that are regulated through positive feedback. One of them is oxytocin during the labor. Another one, very short period, during specifically the ovulation. Production of estrogen results in the increased production of luteinizing hormone, which results in the increased production of estrogen. We're not going to focus on that hormonal loop at all, because in my opinion, the whole regulation only makes sense when we discuss menstrual cycle, ovarian cycle, which we don't, because it is discussed in the reproductive system. So, I promise that there will be no questions on writing an essay and ELISA in the exam. I have to explain it though, so I will. Fairly briefly, I'm going to start, because I hate explaining radioimmune assay. And on top of that, nobody uses it anymore. Okay? So here's the idea. Antigen in this case, see, antigen is a hormone. So scientists developed antibodies. I don't know if you're probably familiar with the term. Antibody is an immune protein that can very specifically recognize certain molecules. So these antibodies will recognize a particular hormone. So you have a known amount of radioactive hormone that's bound to antibodies. You start adding your experimental sample. the concentration of hormone in which? You don't know. As you add your sample, you add a certain amount of unlabeled antigen right here. This unlabeled antigen replaces the radioactive ones. And how much is going to be replaced depends on how much unlabeled antigen you added, unlabeled hormone. Am I making sense? So you can measure the amount of radioactivity that is not bound to antibodies, and the amount of radioactivity that is bound to antibodies. Okay? And since you know the initial stuff, you can quickly calculate how much hormone was in your sample. What do you think is the main drawback of that method? One word. No are. Yes. You have to deal with radioactivity. You can do it. I mean, it's not something insurmountably hard to do, but it's a lot of regulatory stuff. ELISA is much simpler. So, this is the antibody, right? Which will bind the hormone that you add. This blue line represents the plastic well. Okay? So then you can add another antibody that will also recognize that hormone. And then you have the third antibody, which is an antibody that recognizes the second antibody. There may be multiple layers of antibodies, maybe 3, maybe 2. It all depends on the method. There are even assays, I believe, that will have just one antibody. Okay, when you absorb hormone straight on the plate. The point is, no radioactivity. Okay, it's very sensitive. Antibodies are insanely sensitive. The signal that they produce is either color, sometimes it can be luminescence or fluorescence. The point is, ELISA is very easy to automate. It is absolutely quantitative, and it has high processing. So by and large, ELISA is much, in my opinion, much better. Those are different types of antibodies, and that is, say, IgGs are used. Okay? Now, this abomination of a table, I am not going to read to you. Because, after you count all the years that I taught at Tricia at Lakeland, it's like 16, 17 years already. After all those years, I now realize that this is the horrible way to teach endocrine system. This is why I'm going to tell you what's this. I'm not going to mention the table at all. And I will explain why. So this refers to the hormones produced by your hypothalamus. Does it make sense? These are, like this pencil-looking rectangles, are all hypothalamic hormones. Most of them, as you can see, to the left of the red line, they control the production of hormones in the anterior part of your pituitary gland. These two hormones, antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin, they are simply delivered into posterior pituitary and are released when needed. So the names of these hormones, while they do reflect what they regulate in general, they have, all of it makes very little sense when you look at the table. Because you don't know what happens. Like, okay, thyrotropin releasing hormone releases thyrotropin. What's next? Because thyrotropin is not the end of the deal here. Instead, this is going to be your reference point. Instead, we're going to cover every, what we call a hormonal axis separately. And you will see in a minute, well, a few minutes, why we call those signaling pathways an axis. Okay? A couple of things here. I color-coded the hormones. These blue ones, the hormones produced by the anterior pituitary gland, which you must know. I don't know what the color is. These ones are released, yellow. They are released from posterior pituitary but are produced in the hypothalamus. Now these guys, the green and the red, what is green and what is red? Just like a traffic light. The green rectangles are the hormones that are releasing. They let other hormones to be produced. The red rectangles are inhibiting hormones. They obviously can inhibit some stuff. Okay? Yes. Yes. All light blue are produced by anterior pituitary. So that brings us to the pituitary gland. What? What exactly? I can ask you, it's a fair question. I can ask you which of the following hormones is produced by hypothalamus, or which of the following hormones is produced by a pituitary gland. Okay? Making sense? Okay. No idea what just happened. Okay. That's better. So let's take a look at your pituitary gland here. So there are two parts. It does look like a weird scrotum. So this is the anterior pituitary. This is where the action is. This is where hormones are produced. Okay? The posterior pituitary, no hormone production. It's just a storage. Okay? So difference in functions determines the difference in the communication between the hypothalamus and the specific part of the pituitary gland. So we're going to start with the anterior pituitary, if you don't mind. So these are we call them neurosecretory cells. It's neurons. It's basically neurons. These neurons produce hormones that enter the bloodstream in the capillary plexus, or so-called hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system. Okay? Let me take a break and explain why we call it a portal system. So normally, the blood flow is organized this way. Arteries, capillaries, and then veins. Give me 1 second. Now, in this case, the organization is different. Look, it is capillaries. What should go after capillaries? Veins, right? And after veins, and it does, but after veins, you expect through the heart, we turn back to arteries. Now, you have another set of capillaries. Okay? This is why it's called the portal system. There's another one portal system that I can think of, but it's G. So far, body follows me. So, the hormones are released in the primary hypothalamic hormones, released into primary capillary plexus. Then the portal veins carry the blood of the hormones into the anterior pituitary gland, where secondary plexus releases these hormones into the pituitary and they start acting. So the point is, sort of big take-home message, pituitary hormones are effectively controlled by hypothalamus. That's one. Two, they are delivered to the anterior pituitary gland via the hypothalamus hypophyseal portal system. So these are the hormones of the anterior pituitary that you must know. And the thing is, they all are elements of some kind of an axis, even if it doesn't have an official name. For example, thyroid hormone is the part of what's called HPT axis, hypothalamus, pituitary, thyroid. Adrenocorticotropic hormones are the part of hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenal axis, and follicle stimulating hormones, and luteinizing hormone. These are hypothalamus, pituitary, gonadal axis. So this scheme here basically illustrates that point. That's going to be your HPT. This is going to be HPA, and this is going to be three different axes. However, you will see in a minute the growth hormone is regulated in a very similar manner. Okay? So I'm getting all excited because I don't know if I told you, if I would consider becoming a medical professional, either endocrinologist or infectious disease, because this is where the interesting stuff happens. This is where diagnostics happen. This is when you need to think. Now, what type of feedback regulates hormone production? Nick. So if my raised hand is the change and the hormone is produced, the action of this hormone will be lowering my raised hand. Bring it back to normal height. Okay? So what I'm trying to tell you is that if you know the effect of the hormone, you can predict the stimulus, and vice versa. It's not that simple, because some effects are essentially the sum of all actions, but I will highlight how it works, and I will highlight how it works starting with growth hormone. Okay? So first of all, growth hormone has direct and indirect effects. Okay? So hear me out. We're going to connect some dots. Let's start with the direct effects, and then we're going to talk about the regulation. So direct effect, it increases breakdown of fat, releasing fatty acids in the blood. So when fatty acids are being released in the blood, the levels go up. Would you agree with me? Which means stimulus-wise, the level goes down. It also exhibits anti-insulin effects. Okay? So it increases blood glucose, which means the stimulus is decreased blood glucose. In terms of indirect effects, growth hormone increases protein synthesis and in the cells. And proteins are synthesized from amino acids. Would you agree? So growth hormone has to facilitate the removal of amino acids from the blood and delivering them into the cells. So in order for protein synthesis to be successful, you have to have a lot of amino acids in the blood, and they should be taken into the cells. Increased amino acids in the blood. See that? They will stimulate the release of growth hormone, so amino acids can be taken into the cells. Okay, sounds good? Now, all of these can be a result of starvation, or fasting, or something else. When you work out, you use glucose and fatty acids as the source energy, which means your blood glucose and blood fatty acids go down. Okay? That's a twofer for the stimulation of growth hormone. Now, when after workout you drink a protein shake, you deliver a fair amount of energy. Not right away, but you deliver a fair amount of amino acids in your bloodstream, so growth hormone keeps on being elevated. Okay? You also, often, when you exercise, you feel hungry. Right? Ghrelin is the hormone of hunger. It just signals to your hypothalamus that you're hungry. Okay. And there is some, so all of this, if you think about it, decreased blood glucose, decreased fatty acids, increased amino acids. This is an example of humoral regulation, because those are changes in your blood, in extracellular fluid. Okay? Now, the neural stimulation comes from sleep. This graph actually shows very nicely that exercise stimulates hormone production and sleep stimulates growth hormone production. Okay? So let's take a look at the regulation. So first of all, direct effects. Okay? So these are direct effects. Okay? Good. So as the result of these direct effects, it's increased production of fatty acids in the blood. So now look at the regulation. The first hormone that starts this whole chain is growth hormone releasing hormone, or GHRH. If you wonder if there will be acronyms on the exam, there will be. If you wonder if you are all stressed out and have no idea what that acronym means, will I give you a full breakdown? I will. Okay? So, okay, first it's multiple choice, but if I use, say, I use GHRH in my question or answer, and you're like, oh crap. To save my life, I can't remember what it stands for. Just ask me. I'll write it down. I will not tell you what it does. I will just write it down for you. Okay? And then we have, and another effect that is also direct. Amino acid uptake. Okay? Also direct. And glucose release from the liver. Okay, so the red lines here will manifest the direct effect of growth hormone. The yellow line here that's the indirect effect. Why do we call this indirect? Because you need a mediator. Check this out. Growth hormone, when it is released in response to GHRH, it acts on the liver. Liver produces insulin-like growth factor, and this insulin-like growth factor first stimulates growth, but it also plays another important role. It inhibits growth hormone, but growth hormone inhibiting hormone from hypothalamus. Okay, so effectively, think of it this way: you have some kind of a change, let's say low fatty acids in the blood, that triggers the release of growth hormone releasing hormone from hypothalamus. It travels through the hypophyseal portal system to the anterior pituitary, where it stimulates anterior pituitary to produce growth hormone. Growth hormone enters the bloodstream and does things. Among other things, it stimulates liver to release insulin-like growth factor. Insulin-like growth factor isn't only stimulating cells to grow, it also stimulates hypothalamus to produce gonadotropin inhibiting hormone that will knock down that loop. As you will see in most hormonal loops, most hormonal axes, well, all hormonal axes, there is one hormone down at the very bottom of the axis that inhibits the very top, that inhibits hypothalamus, sometimes hypothalamus plus anterior pituitary hormone. Okay, and by the way, insulin-like growth factor also inhibits anterior pituitary, preventing the growth hormone to be released. So, as for all hormones, the problems come either from too much or too little. So what if you have levels of growth hormone that are too high? That's gigantism. To the right of that person, those are regular sized. Okay? Or acromegaly. So childhood gigantism, adulthood acromegaly. So basically the idea is that somebody pretty much formed, like properly, everything's good, right? But then due to some abnormality, most likely a tumor in the anterior pituitary gland, growth hormone stimulates growth of the bones for the most part, and it's mostly bones of the face and hands and feet. Now, what if you have too little? Childhood, pituitary dwarfism. If you're familiar with the Austin Powers franchise, that actor had pituitary dwarfism. You may also be familiar with the TV series The Game of Thrones. Peter Dinklage does not have pituitary dwarfism. His pituitary gland is fine. He has the condition that is called achondroplasia, where his cartilage that facilitates the bone growth doesn't really. His interstitial bone growth was impaired from the childhood. So it's a cartilage problem, not hormone problem. Adulthood, it's really hard to whack out just growth hormone. So it's usually across the board in the anterior pituitary. So people become lethargic because the thyroid hormones levels go down. Adrenocorticotropic hormone is dysregulated. So a lot of problems. So it's not specifically only growth hormone that's affected. Okay? Now, thyroid gland. I mentioned in the beginning that it's easy to memorize water-soluble versus lipid-soluble. Lipid-soluble hormones, thyroid, and steroid. That's it. And steroid hormones can be either produced by gonads, ovaries or testes, or adrenal glands. That's it. When we talk about, pancreas, water-soluble, parathyroid, water-soluble, calcitonin, water-soluble. Okay? So, microanatomy here. Under the larynx, two lobes, surrounds the trachea, largest primary endocrine gland. Now, what about microscopy? So, if you look at the cross-section of a thyroid gland, you can see that there are layers of cuboidal epithelium, follicular and parafollicular cells. Okay? And these layers surround follicles, which are effectively empty spaces. Well, they're not empty, there are no cells there. Follicles are filled with a substance called colloid. So far, we're good? Now, in the homework, you probably have seen the images. Those images will be on the exam. But I just want to make something very clear. I have absolutely no intention to ask you to identify separately follicular versus parafollicular cells. Absolutely. Okay? I mean, it's not bad. Oh, sorry. So this represents, on the right, that's the synthesis of thyroid hormone. I want to highlight a couple of things. You obviously don't need to know the steps of forming the biochemistry class. First of all, what does it require? It requires an amino acid, tyrosine, and iodine. And we're going to talk quite a lot about iodine. We're good so far. Also, I want to highlight that we have technically two thyroid hormones. Triiodothyronine, T3, and thyroxine, T4. The difference? In triiodothyronine, you have 3 iodines. In thyroxine, you have 4. It mostly affects bioavailability of these hormones. More or less hydrophobic. Am I making sense? We're going to treat them as one. But first, let's talk about the synthesis. Where do you get iodine? Where? Where? Well, which part of food more specifically? You get it from salt. Okay? Or, hold on, if you are eating a lot of sea creatures that are fresh caught, you can get them from those creatures as well because they inevitably have iodine. Okay? So, iodine is present in the form of iodide. This ion enters your follicular cells. It is transported actively, and it is converted into iodine, which is used to modify the amino acid tyrosine on the protein called thyroglobulin. I think there are some issues with this image, so hear me out. At the end of the day, what you get, look, you have the hormones here, T4 and T3. If you look at the representation, you see the blue circles represent iodine atoms. So there are 4 at T4 and 3 at T3. I want you to remember this point, that tyrosine or thyroid hormones are still chemically bound to the protein. Okay? So eventually these hormones are separated from the protein. You see the color, it turns from yellow to gray, symbolizing, yeah, these hormones are free. But then we have a problem, a little problem. What is the main chemical component of your blood? Chemical component of your blood that is most abundant. Huh? Nope. You know the answer, I guarantee that. Yes, it's water. Thyroid hormones, not water soluble. So how would you transport them? There are special proteins in the blood, so-called beta globins. You don't need to know that. My point is, since it's lipid soluble, it has to be transported in the watery blood by dedicated proteins. Okay? So, how is it regulated? I like this schematics way more. Okay? So what's going on here? Either the metabolic rate or T3, T4 levels themselves low. Okay, let's say they're low. Little side note, everybody understands what metabolic rate is right now. Like this one. It's the amount of energy that your body consumes doing absolutely nothing. Okay? So, low levels of thyroid hormone or low metabolic rate stimulates hypothalamus. So hypothalamus releases the hormone called TRH, which stands for thyrotropin release hormone. Okay? Now, what the hell is thyrotropin? I'm going to break down its compound word. Well, thyro, obviously, refers to thyroid. But what is tropin? The root of the word tropos, direction. Okay? So thyrotropin means that this hormone, thyrotropin, will act on thyroid gland. Am I making sense? Okay? So when thyrotropin releasing hormone is produced, it acts on your anterior pituitary, and it releases what here is abbreviated as TSH. So TSH stands for thyroid, stimulating hormone, H obviously. And that name is equivalent to thyrotropin. Okay? Now, if you think about the name thyroid stimulating hormone, I mean, it means that it stimulates thyroid, right? Well, yes. Those terms are equivalent. Some people use one, some people use another. So, TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, thyrotropin, they act on the thyroid gland, okay, and those follicular cells release T3 and T4. These hormones act on mitochondria, so they increase basal metabolic rate and increase body temperature, okay, increase utilization of energy. Your basal metabolic rate goes up. Right? And that's your negative feedback, because T3 and T4, just like we saw with insulin-like growth factor, these hormones at the very bottom of the whole chain, they act on hypothalamus and anterior pituitary to stop producing corresponding hormones. Okay? And we will use that concept when we're going to talk about the diseases. Now, these two nice graphs, okay, illustrate. This is how I like the book. It's a medical physiology book. So they show you what happens to the basal metabolic rate. First graph shows that it spikes after the single injection. And this graph shows you how your basal metabolic rate changes in the dose-dependent manner. So you see it increases as the daily dose of thyroid hormone increases as well. Okay? So let me ask you this. Since basal metabolic rate effectively is the energy that your body uses, where does that energy come from that your body uses? Huh? No, fat or carbs, depending what your diet consists of. And if you are running short on food, then it's going to be your own tissues first and foremost. Right? Thyroid hormone is illegally used as what? Well, at least was used. If it increases energy consumption, yeah, to lose weight. It leads to a bunch of pretty bad side effects. It can last for a long time, but acutely it can be used to lose weight. Okay?
So if you have issues with your thyroid, it can be harder for you to lose weight.
Exactly. Well, depends on what issues. So, since thyroid hormone is lipid soluble, it has to bind this. I'm sorry, this was not. How to say? This image was not supposed to be showing such an enormous screen. Okay. So you don't need to know the details. Here's what I want to highlight. This is the hormone here. This is the combination of two receptors. They bind to your DNA and lead to gene expression. Okay? Does that make sense? Now, in addition to these genomic effects that, as we discussed before, are, what the hell is that? As we discussed before, these effects are pretty slow. There are also non-genomic effects. So we have genomic. Those are effects illustrated by the image on the right. What the hell is going on? So non-genomic effects are immediate. Okay. So as you can see, the spike in the increase in basal metabolic rate is pretty long term because it's a genomic effect, but some non-genomics are much quicker. So, what can go wrong? Okay. So, to understand that, I'm actually going to draw this on the side instead of using this letter soup. Okay. So what I'm trying to do is to show you how really easy it is to study hormones. So with this HPT axis, it starts at the hypothalamus. Okay, I'm going to call it HT, which produces thyrotropin releasing hormone. This acts on the anterior pituitary gland, which produces thyrotropin or thyroid stimulating hormone. This one acts on the thyroid gland, which produces T3 and T4. T3 and T4 in turn inhibit your hypothalamus and your APG. Okay? Now let's consider three conditions. Condition number one, and I'm not going to draw anything, we're just going to check. Condition number one, dietary goiter. I don't know if I have the image of that kid over there. Yeah. Okay? So, dietary goiter. Your iodine levels are depleted. You don't have iodine in the food. Can you make thyroid hormone without iodine? No. So if levels of T3 and T4 are low, right, will they inhibit the axis? No. They low. You see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
So when T3 and T4 are low, they fail to do anything to APG and hypothalamus. So now levels of TRH are up and levels of TSH are up. And this is how you can diagnose dietary goiter. Well, there's a much easier way, to be honest. Just by looking at the patient here. So that's dietary goiter. Right here. So what is that enlargement on the boy's neck?
Thyroid.
But why? Okay. You see that levels of TSH are elevated.
Right.
It means that thyroid stimulating hormone constantly, quote unquote, chemically massages the thyroid gland, asking it to produce more thyroid hormone. How does it try to compensate? It tries to become bigger. It is stimulated to become bigger and ideally produce more. It can't because there's not enough iodine and it keeps growing. Good news is if you add iodine to the diet, the enlarged gland will eventually shrink. Okay? Now, two other conditions are Graves' disease and Hashimoto disease. So, first one, Graves, is hyperthyroidism. So, this is a Graves' disease. What happens? In order for, so TSH, right, thyroid stimulating hormone, it acts on thyroid gland. In Graves' disease, there are antibodies that effectively replace TSH. They stimulate thyroid gland independently, and it keeps churning out thyroid hormones. They increase your basal metabolic rate. They basically speed up your metabolism. So what happens? Usually elevated heart rate, which often results in elevated blood pressure. This is characteristic eyes of a person with hyperthyroidism. Okay. And these people are heat intolerant because they generate so much heat of their own. They want to be in a cold room. Okay. Frequent bowel movements. Okay. And what's interesting, the appetite goes up, but the weight really goes down. Okay. And I really like this, nervous, emotional states. I worked with a guy who had controlled Graves' disease, but still, I would rather suggest, he was a bit of a jerk, and I wanted to explain it by Graves' disease rather than by nature who he is really. I don't know. Hypothyroidism, complete difference. Okay? It impacts growth, lethargy, and sleepiness, dry skin, not sweating, slow pulse, constipation, increased weight, all that kind of stuff. You should be able to compare those, like hypo and hyperthyroidism. Like I tell you, which of the following can be a symptom of hypothyroidism? I'm going to make it pretty strict. Like, look, things like dry skin, who cares? Heart, respiration, movement, irritability, weight, things that you should follow. Okay?
Is hypothyroidism and Graves' disease, is that different?
Yes, hypothyroidism is also autoimmune, but it's usually Hashimoto. Okay?
And does that happen like over time, or is that like genetic? I mean, not genetic, but like.
That's a good question. I don't know, because for autoimmune, we don't know the cause. Usually the onset of those problems is fairly early. So again? I don't know. I don't know if there are any other conditions that associated with this. I cannot answer that question. But and this actually is extreme hypothyroidism. So when there's no function, it's called myxedema. So a lot of let's call them carbohydrates, like hyaluronic acid, they're going to bind to the proteins in the extracellular space and will draw water. Okay, so this mean lunch lady, as one student called this photograph, that just appearance because of the impaired thyroid function. What I can tell you is what one of our friends, my wife's good friend, she's an endocrinologist down in Houston, Texas, in the obesity belt. And she says, usually, when you tell people your hormones are off, they like, what should I do? Like, it's a concern, I'm sick, But there, in the obesity belt, people almost beg for hormonal abnormality. Which one do you think? Hyper or hypo? Exactly. Because hypothyroidism vindicates you. Your own failures means that it's hormonal abnormalities that make you overweight, not the behavior. Okay? And she said, like, patients actively asking, like, they would go to different labs to get a slightly different reading so they can be prescribed the analogs of thyroid hormone. Okay, let's take a break.